commandos, peacemakers and presidents. South Africans of Huguenot descent have undeniably made their mark. In every era, they've shaped the country's political life, sometimes divisive, sometimes transformative. The verdict is yours. From the theatre stage to the theatre of the heart, they've influenced South African culture, deepening its understanding of human affairs. Their faces adorn stadium banners. Their grit is in the nation's DNA. Sportsmen filled with South African and Huguenot pride. A scattered tribe, a lasting legacy. Hello, I'm Dr. Philip, and this is Lost History Files. If you're enjoying this channel, please remember to like, subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. And do drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going. In this fourth episode, we continue exploring the Europeanization of Southern Africa, turning the spotlight on a remarkable group of French Protestants who arrived a generation after Jan van Riebeeck landed at Table Bay in 1652. Why did the Huguenots come? How did they adapt, and what is their legacy today? Stay with me as we open the Lost History file on the Huguenots at the Cape, 1688 and beyond. First, where does that curious, evocative word, Huguenot, come from? Well, the answer is disputed. Some trace it to Besançon Hugues, a leader of Geneva's Reformation movement. Others to the German Eidgenossen, confederates bound by oath. And for the superstitious in France, Huguenot was a ghost said to haunt the city of Tours, a jab at Protestants meeting in secret after dark. Whatever its true origin, one thing is certain. Huguenot became a badge of honour and of persecution. The Huguenot legacy at the Cape begins earlier than is often appreciated, with Jan van Riebeeck's wife, Maria de la Cailleraie, herself of Huguenot stock. Her presence, in a position of visibility and influence, may just have subtly prepared the ground for later arrivals. That said, as we'll see, the Dutch East India Company's support for Huguenot immigration was driven less by sympathy and more by pragmatic economic and colonial concerns. But to understand why these immigrants came to the Cape, we must begin in Europe. 17th century France was a land of grandeur and glory. Under Louis XIV, the Sun King, France stood at the pinnacle of European power, militarily formidable, culturally dominant, and above all, spiritually unified. But that unity came at a price. For over a century, France had been home to a sizable Protestant minority, the Huguenots. To be a Huguenot was to follow the teachings of John Calvin, a rigorous, scripture-centred faith that emphasised discipline, personal conscience, and a direct relationship with God, unmediated by priests or popes. The Scottish reformer John Knox called Calvin's Geneva the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on earth since the days of the apostles. That vision of a virtuous, godly society resonated across Europe, and far beyond. It made a lasting impression on the Reformed Protestants who, driven from France, eventually found refuge at the Cape. In France, the Huguenots had endured decades of uneasy tolerance, civil war, and annihilation. The most infamous episode was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, during and after which up to 30,000 Protestants were slaughtered, 3,000 in Paris alone. Many fled the country, and it was during these French wars of religion that the word réfugié was coined in French, meaning someone who had taken refuge. The English word, refugee, was first recorded in 1628, directly shaped by these events, when Fulk Greville, the Elizabethan writer and statesman, wrote of the settling of Huguenot refugees in England in his Life of Sir Philip Sidney. In 1598, a glimmer of hope had arrived when French King Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, granting limited religious freedoms in a desperate effort to secure peace. But peace in France was rarely permanent. By the 1680s, Louis XIV viewed religious uniformity not merely as a virtue, but as a necessity for his absolute monarchy. In 1685, at Fontainebleau, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. Overnight, Protestant churches were closed, schools shuttered and pastors exiled. Huguenot laypeople faced three grim choices: convert to Catholicism, worship in secret, or flee the country. Many who stayed were killed or sold as galley slaves for the French and Turkish fleets. In 1985, President Mitterrand of France issued a public apology 300 years on from the Revocation. Do such gestures carry any weight, centuries later? The most feared tactic was the dragonnade, the forced billeting of soldiers in Huguenot homes to harass, intimidate, and coerce conversions. It was spiritual warfare, executed through the machinery of the state. Thousands were arrested. Children were torn from their parents to be raised Catholic. Many Huguenots went underground. Others fled for their lives. Tragic in any circumstances. But these were not peasants or serfs. They were skilled artisans, farmers, doctors, and scholars. In driving them out, France expelled some of its brightest minds and most industrious hands. Around 200,000 Huguenots fled to Protestant lands, the Netherlands, England, Switzerland, Prussia, and as far afield as North America and Brazil. A much smaller number boarded ships bound for the distant Dutch colony at the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape was remote, but it was Protestant and Dutch, and for the faithful in exile that was enough. It was the Dutch East India Company in 1687 that granted them refuge. The VOC, ever pragmatic, saw an opportunity. Here were hard-working, devout and desperate families, perfect for strengthening the fragile colony on the southern tip of Africa. They didn't accept just anyone. Stringent rules were applied, starting with a compulsory oath of allegiance to the Netherlands. The newcomers were expected to bring valuable skills, particularly in wine production and farming. In return for the enticing promise of 60 morgen of land, over 100 acres, they were required to spend at least 5 years in the fledgling colony. This land grant was substantial, large enough to support vineyards, orchards, or a mixed farm. It's one reason why the Huguenot contribution to Cape agriculture proved so enduring. Less well known is the fact that the VOC made an earlier attempt to recruit Huguenots, but this was largely unsuccessful. In 1671, 21-year-old François Bastion from Armentières became the first Huguenot refugee to arrive, but there were few others at this stage. However, as persecution against Protestants in France intensified, the second recruitment drive, bolstered by the promise of more land along with Vrijburger status, saw a much better response. The main exodus of the Huguenots to South Africa did not, as is often believed, occur solely between 1688 and 89, when nearly 200 arrived. Rather, their migration unfolded over more than 3/4 of a century, a steady stream of refugees fleeing persecution. While state-subsidised immigration ceased in 1706, the flow of Huguenot settlers continued for decades, their contributions to the Cape's development enduring long after the formal relocation efforts ended. Still, the total number of newcomers was modest, compared, for example, to the 50,000 plus who found sanctuary in England. So it might surprise some that the Huguenots have left a significant genetic imprint on South Africa. As mentioned in an article by the Huguenot Society of South Africa, research suggests that their descendants make up around 24% of the Afrikaner gene pool, more than any other non-Dutch heritage, including German, Scandinavian and Flemish, as well as smaller proportions of Asian and African ancestry. If you're South African, have you had your DNA tested, and if so, what were the results? Do drop a comment below. Through this influx of Huguenots, the Cape, originally intended as a mere provisioning stop for Dutch ships, became something far greater, a beacon for those who had lost everything, a refuge where faith, land and hope could take root once again. But just getting to the Cape was an ordeal in itself. It's December 1687, more than 2 years since the chilling effect of Fontainebleau. A literal chill wind coils through the narrow streets of La Rochelle. Families pack what little they can carry, Bibles, heirlooms, seeds and memories, for they're leaving. Not for adventure, not for commerce, but because they must. Hunted by a state that once promised them protection, only to tear that promise apart. And so they board ships. 4 months at sea, malnutrition, sickness, storms. Some never made it, but others stepped ashore at Table Bay, weary but resolute. Much like the Puritan emigration to America across the wild Atlantic, surviving the journey itself became a sign of providence, reinforcing their sense of being a chosen people. It was an image that bred resilience and at times a certain stubbornness, even obduracy. Religious conviction and a vast untamed land have always been a potent blend. Among them were names that would one day be etched into South Africa's history. Leroux, Labachonne, de Villiers, Duplessis, Malan, Joubert, Marais, Pinard. Equally significant, for they were freely chosen, were the Christian names they brought with them. François, Pierre, Etienne, Jacques, André and Louis. Names that remain widespread and cherished among their descendants today. Notable early Huguenot settlers included Jean de Long, known for helping establish early farms in the Cape region. Etienne Rousseau, an early winemaker and farmer, and one of many Rousseaus who contributed to South Africa's viticultural development. And Guillaume Dutoit, who established wine farms in the Paarl region, and whose family name remains prominent in South African agriculture and winemaking. François Retief was an early settler linked to farming success, and an ancestor of Piet Retief, a key figure among the Voortrekkers. Paul Roux was a farmer and religious leader who contributed to the early spiritual life and governance of the French community. The Freetown state of Paul Roux was named after his descendants, and Jean-Pierre Duplessis, whose descendants include numerous South African cultural and political figures. At the Huguenot Memorial in Franschhoek, many of the names of the early Cape Huguenots, and the ships that carried them, are engraved on a sundial. Fittingly, the sun pointer bears the Vaudois Latin motto, Post tenebras lux, light after darkness. They were few in number, but their impact was lasting and profound. In April 1688, the first ship, the Verschutten, dropped anchor in Table Bay. On board were nearly 24 Huguenot families, weary from the voyage but unbroken in spirit. 8 more ships would follow. By the end of 1689, over 180 Huguenots had arrived at the Cape. Free passage was granted by the VOC, and upon arrival, they were given land, implements, seeds and tools. Then they were escorted to their new farms. But many soon grew dissatisfied with the quality of the soil and petitioned Governor Simon van der Stel, the man who gave his name to Stellenbosch, for permission to relocate. Van der Stel eventually agreed. It's worth noting that in 1691, a Huguenot settler, Pierre de l'Olive, assisted Van der Stel in establishing the Cape Colony's first formal land grants, a foundational act that still echoes today in South Africa's ongoing and currently highly topical debates about land expropriation without compensation. Most of the newcomers were eventually settled inland, among and just beyond existing Dutch farms, in a fertile region called Drakenstein. To the north lay the Berg River, to the east a range of rugged mountains that would later give the valley its name, Franschhoek, the French corner, where to this day many of South Africa's Huguenot descendants still live. The town's flag strongly gestures to its French Huguenot origins, as does its coat of arms, which features the fleur-de-lis and grape motifs. Others were allotted land in the Dwars River Valley, as well as in what are now Wellington, formerly Wagenmakkersville, and Stellenbosch. Many of the settlers named their new farms after the regions in France from which they had fled: Languedoc and Provence, Calais and Cabrières. Among the earliest established were La Motte, La Cotte, Chamonix, Dieudonné and La Dauphine, names that still endure today. Many of these farms retain their original homesteads, most built from scratch. It would be easy to romanticize their new lives, but the reality was far harsher. Many arrived with little and faced continual hardship. The climate and terrain were unfamiliar, and much of the land remained poorly suited to grazing or growing crops. At first they had only rudimentary tools and often lacked the funds to buy additional seeds and other essentials. Drought, difficult transport routes, theft, and unfair competition from VOC officials only added to their struggles. Yet through it all, they endured. They dug irrigation channels, planted wheat and fruit, and, most famously, vines. Some brought with them knowledge of viticulture from France. Others adapted traditional methods to new soil, a harsher sun, and unpredictable seasons. It was arduous work. They were poor, desperately poor, and in those early months the ache of exile never left them. As one early settler wrote in her journal, "I still awake at dawn expecting to hear the bells of La Rochelle, but the winds here carry only the cries of seabirds and the whisper of vineyards yet to be planted." Yet it was a start, and from these rocky beginnings, quite literally, South Africa's world-renowned wine industry was born. Growth was rapid. The number of vine plants at the Cape increased from 100 in 1655 to 1.5 million in 1700. The Huguenot legacy at the Cape endures in every glass of South African wine, with the vineyards of Stellenbosch and Franschhoek standing as living testaments to their spirit. When the English priest and travel writer John Ovington visited the Cape in 1693, he observed with admiration that their vineyards have been established over an area of more than 75 English miles, yet they still have their eyes on larger tracts of virgin soil before them. In this district, they farm with livestock, plant maize, establish vineyards, and improve everything conscientiously for the greatest benefit. Some Huguenots also brought expertise in silk farming, cheese-making, and agricultural innovation, skills that left an indelible mark on the land. Along with these practical talents, they carried a Protestant work ethic, one already familiar to their Dutch neighbours, as well as traditions of family literacy, theological depth, and a quiet dignity forged through years of persecution. Still, their world was not entirely their own. The VOC remained wary of foreign influence, and within 2 generations, the Huguenots were expected to assimilate, culturally and linguistically, into Dutch society. French was banned in schools, and Dutch became the language of worship and instruction. Even their names were adapted. Duplessis became De Plessis, Leclerc became De Klerk. Some resisted, most did not. Over time, their distinct French identity softened, absorbed into a broader settler culture still in the making. Yet they never forgot their origins. One settler wrote in his diary, "Our language may fade among our children, but our spirit must not. Let them speak Dutch, but let them remember they are free because we would not kneel to a despotic king." Though Huguenot French was largely replaced by Dutch, its linguistic imprint remains, especially in Afrikaans. Words like klera for clothes, skuiki, small shop, and certain everyday expressions still betray their French roots. These terms evolved into uniquely Cape Dutch forms and later became part of Afrikaans, shaping the culture and language of the region in ways that endure to this day. They were a people carrying a vision, one shaped by Geneva and largely shared by their new Dutch neighbours. The Dutch Reformed Church, rooted in the same Calvinist tradition, emphasised moral order, divine providence and church discipline. So although the Huguenots initially spoke a different language, they were stepping into a spiritual world that was familiar, one striving, however imperfectly, to mirror the order and piety of Calvin's Swiss city on a hill. However, this religious certainty, marked by their Calvinistic assurance of salvation, also shaped their perception of both the land and its people. They were eager to spread the gospel to indigenous populations, but many commentators claim they were inclined to view them through a lens of spiritual and cultural inferiority, believing themselves divinely appointed to lead. This mindset may help explain why slave ownership, including among the Huguenots, became commonplace at the Cape, and why Britain's abolition of slavery across its empire in 1833 had such profound consequences. It should be noted, however, that many enslaved people in the colony lived within the households of their owners, often becoming integrated into daily family life, as was also the case, though in smaller numbers, in the Netherlands, though of course they remained bound by coercion rather than kinship. By the early 18th century, the Huguenots were no longer seen as foreigners. Their surnames, farming techniques and religious practices had become deeply woven into the broader cultural fabric of the colony. Though they had arrived as exiles, they were now central to the Dutch Protestant framework of the Cape. Their churches stood alongside Dutch Reformed congregations, and their voices, once distinctly French, had blended into a new colonial dialect. This process of successful assimilation was further accelerated by intermarriage. Many Huguenot descendants married into Dutch Cape families, united by their shared Calvinist faith. And what of that faith? As one historian noted, nowhere on earth is the legacy of Calvin stronger than in South Africa. Their Calvinism reinforced the Protestant atmosphere of the colony, with churches like the Huguenot Church in Franschhoek standing as enduring symbols of faith and perseverance. Dutch and French Bibles, along with psalters, became treasured possessions, either brought with them or acquired in the new colony. The sacred texts displayed at the Huguenot Memorial Museum in Franschhoek underscore the immense value placed on owning a personal copy. One legend tells of Pierre Joubert, who smuggled his Bible, dated 1672, out of France hidden inside a loaf of bread. Joubert's Bible became more than a book. It was a symbol of defiance, a token of faith carried through hardship and risk. As Protestants, the Huguenots placed a high premium on reading scripture for themselves, fostering literacy and education. This emphasis on personal engagement with the Bible likely influenced broader Cape society's respect for schooling and Bible study. Pierre Simon was appointed by the VOC as pastor to the Huguenots. He created a new verse translation of the Huguenot Psalter, the biblical Book of Psalms, which was published in Amsterdam in 1704 under the title Les Veilles Africains ou les Psaumes de David, African Vigils or the Psalms of David. This work has been described as the first notable contribution to South African literature and theology. In an age where the written word was a powerful tool of influence, Simon's Psalter became a cornerstone of both spiritual and intellectual life in the Cape. The arrival of the Huguenots in the Cape left a significant mark on the region's architectural landscape. Their blend of French grace and Dutch practicality led to the development of what we now recognise as Cape Dutch architecture. The whitewashed homesteads with thatched roofs and tall curving gables reflect their refined sense of style, balanced by the practical needs of the new land. While this architectural style was modest compared to the grandiose buildings of Europe, it is widely praised for its symmetry, proportion, and quiet elegance, qualities that still make these homes distinctive today. Their influence, though sometimes overshadowed by the stronger Dutch legacy, contributed a unique and lasting beauty to the Cape. Today, the Huguenot architectural legacy is most clearly seen, and felt, in Franschhoek. Standing tall at the end of the village is the Huguenot monument, completed in 1945. Designed by Dutch architect J.C. Jongens, it is more than stone and sculpture. It's a visual sermon. 3 soaring arches represent the Holy Trinity. At the centre stands a woman carved by Coet Steinberg, holding a Bible and a broken chain, symbols of faith and freedom, hard won and never forgotten. The Huguenot cross is prominently featured. First adopted by French Protestants in the 16th century, it became an enduring emblem of resilience and resistance during the brutal years of persecution. The cross itself is rich with meaning. Its 4 arms signify the spread of the gospel across the world. The 8 points recall the 8 Beatitudes. Each fleur-de-lis represents resurrection, with 3 petals standing for the Holy Trinity, and 12 petals in total, 1 for each apostle. The 4 tiny hearts symbolise love and loyalty to Christ, while beneath it all a descending dove represents the Holy Spirit, ever present, ever guiding. For those fleeing the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the cross was a silent declaration of defiance, a reminder of their unyielding belief in religious freedom. Just beyond the monument lies the Huguenot Memorial Museum, housed in the reconstructed Suzfeld House, an 18th century manor originally designed by French architect Louis-Michel Thibault. Dismantled in Cape Town and carefully reassembled here in the 1950s, it stands as a tribute to classical French elegance, symmetry, proportion and restraint, all brought to African soil. Nearby stands the Dutch Reformed Church built in 1847. This structure speaks to the spiritual continuity of the community. Though Dutch in style, its roots are deeply entwined with those of the Huguenots, who worshipped, married and mourned here. These are more than heritage sites. They are touchstones of identity, echoing a story of exile, endurance and quiet transformation. Today, the Huguenot legacy endures in Franschhoek. Many descendants of the original settlers still honour their heritage, bearing French surnames, preserving traditions and tending the same soil their ancestors once did. The Huguenot monument and museum stand as lasting symbols of their journey, while the region's thriving wine culture remains a living tribute to their pioneering spirit. Each year, on the last weekend of October, Franschhoek pauses to remember. The Huguenot festival draws together descendants and visitors alike to celebrate not only the resilience of the past, but the richness it continues to bring to South African life today. The story of the Huguenots in South Africa is more than a tale of exile. It's a story of identity and belonging. These were people who arrived at the Cape as refugees, fleeing persecution, seeking sanctuary, but over time they became integral to South Africa's unfolding narrative. From the early days of Jan van Riebeeck to the turbulent era of the Boer War and beyond, the Huguenots have left a lasting imprint, not in numbers, but in spirit. The land they helped cultivate became more than a means of survival. It became a symbol of ownership, of rootedness, of independence. In time, this deep connection to the land gave rise to a fierce sense of identity, a Boer spirit, rooted in faith, perseverance, and a profound attachment to the soil. Over generations, this bond helped shape the emergence of Afrikaner identity. Many of those of Huguenot descent remained on their Western Cape farms and wine estates during the Great Trek of the 1830s and 40s, but they shared the same frustrations and aspirations as the trekkers. For the Boers, it was not merely an escape from British control. It was an assertion of their right to shape their own future, and in that future, the Huguenot legacy would prove undeniable. Their descendants would find themselves at the heart of South Africa's struggle for freedom and identity. The Boer War would be the culmination of this story. A battle not just for land, but for sovereignty and self-determination. Though the Huguenots had never sought independence for themselves, their legacy would become intertwined with the struggle that would ultimately shape the nation's future. We could put it this way. When the British Army faced Afrikaner forces in the Boer War, did it help them that among the enemy's ranks were men of Huguenot descent, not just Dutch? Clearly not. In the face of adversity, it mattered little whether one was of Dutch or French extraction. What mattered was the collective spirit of those who had come to call the land their own. Long before British ships cast anchor in Table Bay, it was the Huguenots, fleeing persecution and brimming with purpose, who left the most powerful non-Dutch imprint on the Cape. In the vineyards of Franschhoek, in the surnames that echo through South African history, and in the faith they carried from France, the Huguenots did not merely arrive, they assimilated and they enriched. The Cape stayed Dutch in law, church and tongue, yet something else took root. A French frisson, not of doctrine but of spirit. It didn't radically alter the Dutch foundation so much as deepen it. And in that deepening lies a legacy, embodied in our Huguenots' who's who, that lingers to this day.